Alright guys, I'm going to be streaming the Destiny 2 story. Alright guys, I'm going to be streaming the yes, okay. Yeah, that's me. Okay, so let me just turn it off. Okay guys, so I am going to be streaming the Destiny 2 story. Actually, this is a Destiny story. I think the whole Destiny, right, from the Origins all the way to ShadowKeep. It's going to take about 4 hours. So feel free to hop on and off when you need to. I'm just going to watch it in the background, and you can talk and chat in the chat as usual. I'll be around. I have a couple of things to do, so this is something in the background that I'm going to be active on, but I'm going to turn off my mic after this so we can all enjoy the story of Destiny from the origins of the Hive in the Books of Sorrow to Destiny 2 Shadowkeep. And after that, I'm going to maybe share another video that covers from Shadowkeep all the way to what we have now in the Arrivals. So this video covers the full timeline of Destiny, including major events, the lore, the backstories of the universe, and everything really that you need to keep up to date on for Destiny 2 up to Destiny 2 Shadowkeep, which is the previous expansion, and the new light is coming in September. So let's see. So this is actually a video I found online, so I'm just showing you this video, and this is actually for the community so that we can talk and chat and just interact with this. So this is everything to do with the timeline and the lore, and it's all explained by this wonderful YouTuber, and you see who he is inside. He's going to introduce himself, and basically, like I said, the next 4 hours, approximately 4 hours, and maybe change, we can talk about this together as a community as we talk about Destiny. And I know a lot of fans here are really big fans of Destiny, so let's talk about that. So without further ado, let me I got an incoming call. Okay, I'll be right back. I gotta answer this call. Alright, I'm back. See, that was a fast call. Great, so let's begin immediately. Let's cool. So any questions? Anyone want to chat and say hello in chat? Let me make sure the chat works. Yes, it does. And I'm going to be off mic after this. Like I said, I want to make sure that everything is working properly just before I start. Let me just type some message. Alright, so today, hello, and we are going to be getting into this immediately. Just give me a few more seconds to set up stuff. So this is the complete story. I'm just going to put this in. Right, so I'm just going to post this here as well so you can all see that in the chat. Everyone see that? Okay, respawn. Okay, everything works. Okay, let's begin. So excited about this. I've been wanting to do this for a while now, and I also need to know the backstory. So here we go. Woohoo!
Greetings, Guardians. My name is Bife here. What you're about to watch is the culmination of 5 years of studying the lore and stories of Destiny. This is the complete story of Destiny so far, until Destiny 3 comes along, that is. Now, I know that a lot of you who are in my audience absolutely love these long videos, but for those of you who are watching this and are thinking that the video is something you might not want to watch in one stretch, don't worry, I have designed it quite deliberately with that in mind. I've broken the video up into a bunch of different chronological sections so that you've got different points where you can stop and start at your leisure. Beyond just this, if you want to catch up on a particular section, or if you are simply missing one part of Destiny's history, you can find a timestamp to navigate to them down below in the description, unless you are watching this live at the premiere. Before we start, I think I should also lend my thanks and my words here to a pair who helped immeasurably in the process of creating this video, Captain Tullus and Mr. Monkus. Tullus helped me edit this massive project and to create something truly incredible for you all to watch, and Monkus helped create pieces of artwork that outlined the start of each section of the video, artwork which he did for free even when I repeatedly asked to commission him. The very least that you guys can do is show your appreciation for these two gentlemen in the comments section down below, and if you love any of the art that you've seen in this video, you will find a link to Monkus' website down below where you can buy prints of all of the pieces that Monkus creates. These ones may be up there by the time this video is live. But with all of that said, I think you've waited long enough. It's time to tell you all the complete story of Destiny, from the ancient history of Fundament, all the way to the ShadowKeep of Luna. So, let us begin. The ancient history of Destiny starts not with humanity, and not with Earth. The records from this time supposedly date back millions of years with a record of histories and ceremony kept by the Hive, known only as the Books of Sorrow. The veracity of these accounts is sometimes thrown into question, with one of the Hive gods even scrawling in its pages that they are full of lies. But as it stands, these books represent our only record of a series of times from millions to potentially hundreds of millions of years ago that would otherwise be lost and unrecognizable to us. And so, with nothing else to tell us any better, and armed with the knowledge that these records may be imperfect, we must start with the records made in the Books of Sorrow, not at Earth, but on a distant shadowed world called Fundament. Fundament was a gas giant, one so massive that its gravity could pull other planets down beneath its clouds, where they would impact on its surface oceans. The remains of these planets would form into continents, and on these continents, life of a sort would struggle to carve out an existence. The smallest form of life on Fundament was that of the Krill, and they were constantly under threat from the harsh world upon which they lived. There were many nations of Krill, and one such nation was the Osmium Court, and their king, its ruler, was about to be put through dire straits. Their king was 10, a long and withering existence for the short-lived Krill, save for their mother spawn who lived significantly longer. The king of the court had 3 offspring: Shiro, the youngest, who aspired to the ways of combat so she might seek adventure and defend her people; Sethona, the wisest, one who wished to consume the royal jelly and become a long-lived mother so that she could learn all of the secrets of the world, and Aurash, the eldest. She who was to become the next ruler of the Osmium court, she who was to take the Kingmorph and to replace her aging father. Though they could not possibly know it, these three siblings would change the universe forever, and would be led down a path of destruction so great that it would shake the foundations of reality itself. But this all began with their father's assassination. Their father was senile at the time. Most Krill who were long-lived would die at the age of 8, but at 10 years old the king was being driven to madness. But to some, it was evident that there was at least some method in his madness. He would study the sky, raving of moons above Fundament's eternal storm clouds, and always he was accompanied by his familiar, a white worm-like thing that was dead but had washed up from the sea depths. In a state of despondence and in response to the king's consistent madness, Teox, a mother of the Osmium court, wrote to their arch-enemies, the Helium Drinkers, begging for them to kill the king of the Osmium court and to slay his 3 offspring, offering to rule as a regent for them beneath their command in his stead. The Helium Drinkers happily accepted and slew the Osmium king, but they were not fast enough to slay his progeny. Shiro, Sathona, and Aurash fled with their father's familiar and took a ship out onto the great oceans of Fundament. Upon its mast, they swore in blood that in their lifetimes they would return to the Osmium court and avenge their father, kill Teox and the Helium Drinkers, and understand the doom that their father spoke of as he raved in what many believed to be madness, but the sisters were slowly starting to realize might well be something to be concerned of. The doom that their father spoke of was later divined by Aurash, who remembered the last words that her father had said to her, namely, that the moons were different and that the laws were bent. He made a sign representing a syzygy, and it was this that revealed to Aurash the nature of their doom. In the skies above Fundament, there were 52 moons in orbit, but if all of them fell into the correct alignment, they would pull in the same direction all at once, and they would therefore pull the vast waters of Fundament's oceans into a massive bulge beneath where they lay. When the combined force of their gravitational pull passed, the mass of water would then be dispersed in all directions in the form of a tidal wave that would swallow whole civilizations, a god wave. Their quest was now even more urgent. Shiro, Sathona, and Aurash needed to not only defeat the traitors, but to save their world and their people from extinction. In their extended travels, they found a great crashed ship, an artifact of a bygone era, an artifact of a greater civilization. This was not necessarily a seafaring ship, it was potentially a spacefaring one. It was the Needle, and they had only found it thanks to the whispering of their father's worm, which was now held by Sathona. The dead familiar that the king had always brought with him was apparently able to communicate with her, and with its advice, they held onto the Needle instead of selling it. They then took a further 2 years not only to repair the ship's systems, but also to deeply understand them. But as 2 years passed, Sathona grew worried. She believed that they would not have the time they needed to see the dream of their vengeance realized. It is then that Aurash stated that they should dive. They had long since learned that they could use the ship to chart the immeasurable depths of Fundament's oceans, and Aurash believed that below the waves, closer to the planet's core, they might find answers. Shiro protested, remembering the bodies of the ship's prior owners and how something from down in the deeps had clearly caused their ruin. But Savathun, who had heard the worm familiar whisper to her of the plan's brilliance, agreed with Aurash. And so, the descent began. Through the crushing depths and past terrifying beasts, the siblings ventured until they came to a still place. Here, they monitored the waves above, and the sensors of the ship stated that their fears of a syzygy were indeed true. It was indeed coming to pass, and it was at that moment that they encountered the Leviathan, a creature as massive as the continents of their childhood, and it spoke to them, urging them to turn away from the depths of Fundament and from the deep itself. The Leviathan's voice was booming inside their heads, massive, forceful, and determined at first, but when finally it was exhausted by the protests of Aurash and Shiro, Sathona would state that they should dive. Her justification was completely clear at this point. She stated that she was guided by her father's familiar, and that this was what had given them hope, whilst the Leviathan merely wished for them to return to the surface of Fundament to live short lives and die. And so they continued to dive deeper, down into the crushing depths of Fundament's core. And down in those depths, Aurash found herself standing unprotected on the hull of the ship. But in spite of the immense pressure and heat, she was unharmed. Before her there were 5 massive creatures. They were the Worm Gods: Yul the Honest Worm, Zol the Will of Thousands, the Ever-Hunger, Ire the Keeper of Order, and Akka the Worm of Secrets. Ancient creatures that served the deep, or as we now know it, the darkness. Yul offered Aurash and her sisters a bargain, and told them that the Worm Gods had been trapped in Fundament's core for eons by the Leviathan. Their bargain was simple. They would be granted immortal life by consuming the children of the Worm Gods, but they had to always obey their nature as beings. Shiro would be perpetually attempting to test her strength, Sathona her cunning, and Aurash her knowledge of the universe and her explorations of it. The sisters accepted the bargain and took the Worm God's larvae back to the surface once they had all chosen new morphs and new names. Shiro, Sathona, and Aurash ceased to be, and with that, the birth of the ascendant Hive Gods Shivu-Arath, Savathun, and Aurix was complete, with Shivu-Arath taking up the Night Morph, Savathun taking up the Mother Morph, and Aurix the King Morph. They rose again to the surface of Fundament, feeding the Worm God's children to any krill that would follow them, and killing the rest. The war they brought to the surface eventually engulfed all of Fundament, with the survivors falling back to Kahan Atoll. The Worm Gods eventually rose to the surface with them, and escaped Fundament with the forces of the sisters. They pursued Teox, the sterile mother who had betrayed the Osmium dynasty to one of Fundament's icy moons. On that moon, the Worm Gods discovered that there was another race inhabiting it, known as the Ammonite, and that there was also a 53rd moon hanging above its orbit, although technically this was not a moon at all. It was a divine presence of the deep's polar opposite. It was a presence of the sky, or the light as we better know it. And what was this presence? The Traveler. The Krill and the Worm Gods undertook a campaign of annihilation against the Ammonite, Teox, and the Traveler. And whilst Teox would escape during the campaign, the siblings of the Osmium dynasty, especially Ulrix, learned of the ways of the sword logic and embraced a dark power, making them even more terrifying and giving Teox good reason to flee. During the war, though, Ulrix was struck with ideals of pacifism, which enraged the Worm Gods. They believed in the ideals of the sword logic, that life should be tested against life, that only the strong should remain. The worm that Ulrix had consumed in the depths of Fundament yearned for war, and eventually This hunger was starting to gnaw at his soul and led him back into the fray. But even after this, he still offered to parley with the Ammonite on neutral ground. It was then that the worm gods demanded Savathun teach him, and teach him she did. She betrayed Ulrix. She killed him. But Ulrix did not die. Instead, he awoke in his throne world, a part of the Ascendant Realms, an alternate dimension where the Hive Ascendants go when they die. It is only in this Ascendant Realm that he could truly be killed. And whilst Ulrix was recovering, Savathun went to the neutral ground and poisoned it, killing the representatives of the Ammonite that were meant to meet at the point to parley for peace. Before the war was won, the Leviathan came forth from the depths of Fundament, and was slain by the forces of the deep in a final battle of Fundament's moons that shook the worlds to their core. After burrowing out of the worlds they'd conquered and multiplying at a great pace, the Krill would take up a new name as a species and would be referred to from this moment until time ended as the Hive. They strengthened their resolve and battled each other for over 20,000 years, and then, at last, they set out stronger, and they set out on a campaign of genocide across the universe, fighting many different species and bringing all of them to their end, finding them unworthy of the Sword Logic's challenge, the test that states life should exist with strength. However, they encountered a problem, as Ulrix discovered that the more they fought, the more the hunger of their worms expanded, and so they faced the threat that they would not be able to satisfy their worms' insatiable hunger. This put the supposed immortality that the worm gods had offered them into context, but beyond just this, it set the stage for a greater threat that was looming on the horizon. An alien empire known as the Ecumene came to face the power of the siblings. They had diverted all their resources into a campaign of utter annihilation against the Hive, responding with overwhelming force whenever Ulrix, Savathun, or Shivu-Arath appeared. They knew exactly how to defeat the Hive, and this was no coincidence, because they were being guided in that method of destruction by Teox, the traitor mother. Eventually, the siblings were beaten back so much that they were left with no strength to go on fighting. They gathered in Ulrix's throne world and assessed their options. Whilst Shivu-Arath wanted to retreat and gather strength, and Savathun wanted to beg the worm gods for more power, at this point, Ulrix knew the logic of the sword better than them both, and knew that they needed to aggressively proclaim their right to exist through war and death. As this truth was affirmed, a plan of action was devised. In this plan, Ulrix slew his two sisters, and by the sword logic, became more powerful by proving his might over them. With their true deaths under his wing, Ulrix went to Akka, the worm god of secrets, and told him that he wished to receive the secrets of the deep. When Akka said he gave no secrets, Ulrix rebuffed the worm god and stated that giving was for the sky and that he had to take what he wanted, even if it meant killing Akka, even though Akka was his god. And so Oryx slew Akka the worm god, and from his ruin he pulled the secret of communing with the deep. He recorded that secret on a series of tablets known as the Tablets of Ruin, and hung them about his waist. Following this, he used the secret to enter the deep itself, and whilst his speech with the deep was not recorded, what is known as this: when he emerged from the deep, he pronounced that he was Ulrix no longer. Instead, he was Oryx, the Taken King, and that he had the power to take life and make it his own. It was at this moment that Ulrix went out into the universe and unleashed his new powers upon the Ecumene forces, namely his new ability to take, which allowed him to abduct his enemies, corrupt them with darkness, and return them as compliant slaves bound to his will and given new abilities thanks to the power of the sword logic. It was too much for the Ecumene, and eventually they were pushed back and slaughtered. It is here that Oryx enacted two peculiar Hive resurrections. In spite of their deaths being true, both Xivu-Arath and Savathun were returned to life, each of them respectively summoned back with war and trickery. The Ecumene were eradicated so completely after this that only in the Books of Sorrow and in the mind of Teox, who yet again had evaded their capture, were they even remembered. All note of them, all memory, all trace was wiped from the universe. Following this, Oryx would have moments and time to commune with the darkness, thanks to the rituals recorded on the tablets of ruin, and the darkness would show him terrible dreamlike hallucinations, replicating his childhood and teaching him to be yet more brutal, to embrace the sword logic even further. Oryx also learned that Xivu-Arath and Savathun were at this moment conspiring to leave him stranded on his expedition into the deep. Despite this, he was brought back, and when he was brought back, he endeavored to bring sons and daughters into this world so that he might love and kill them, so that all would be empowered and strengthened. The first of these children was Crota, the Eater of Hope, whose strength was unparalleled and who would one day rise to be one of the greatest champions of the Hive. The second was Nokris, who was feeble in strength but strong in mind, more of a wizard than a knight, unlike his demon brother. The third and fourth of his children came from a single larvae, cleft in two by Oryx's great sword Willbreaker. The larvae became the twin daughters of Oryx, the death singers Uranuk, the Weaver, and Ur-Halak, the Unraveler. Oryx's children accomplished many great deeds, and their stories were numerous. From the creation of the Death Song to the destruction of whole axioms of the universe, Oryx's daughters, in particular, were highly accomplished. One day, they were cutting a wound in reality, and were proceeding to die inside it. When Oryx inquired as to why, they stated that they would seek to create an oversoul as a way of both hiding their deaths as well as creating a death impulse capable of defending their throne worlds if needs be. Oryx told Crota that he should observe his sisters and try to learn cunning from them, and so Crota too decided that he should experiment with a wound in reality. However, when Crota tore open a wound in reality, it was thanks to Savathun, who had manipulated the wound, that a partially mechanical form of life poured forth from it, a race known as the Vex. The exact origins of the Vex and the nature of their power is shrouded in a fair deal of mystery, but they spilled forth from the breach and began to invade Oryx's throne world. Before Crota could respond by destroying them all, a Vex mind manifested known as Coria Blade Transform, which deduced the sword logic. With this knowledge of the particular universe in which they stood at their hand, the Vex began to slaughter Oryx's thrall and acolyte, and by right of conquest and slaughter, had gained a foothold and presence within Oryx's throne world as they invaded it with force, obeying the logic of the new space that they had found. In spite of Uranuk and Ur-Halak pulling sword stars from the sky and creating devices known as the Annihilator Totems to stop them, the Vex would press forth unabated. It was only as Coria abducted the children of the Worm Gods and discovered that by praising them it could gain even more power that the Worm God Aya stepped in, telling Oryx to set his house in order. Oryx returned home and slew the Vex invaders, pushing them and Coria back. As punishment, he took Crota and threw him into the Vex Gate network, saying, "Come home glorious, or die forgotten." Crota would accomplish this, going on to be a legendary demon of the Hive, tearing down his opponents and allowing only a few to survive to tell of the wrath of the Osmium dynasty. But even though Crota had succeeded, there was still a problem, because Oryx's throne world was now left with a tear inside it, a tear that left him weak to a counterattack, or potentially sabotage by one of his sisters. And so, before his court, he declared that they would transform his throne world, his part of the Ascendant Plane, into a physical ship in the material world. This was the Dreadnought, and it was built not only from parts of Akka's corpse, but with the incredibly terrifying, mind-bending power of Oryx and his Hive. His court worked in tandem to create what was effectively a paradox. A throne world of the Ascendant Plane pushed into physical space, a screaming, gaping hole in what would be reality. But regardless, Oryx's power was so incredible that even breaking the laws of physics themselves was nothing towards his might. With this accomplished, Oryx's throne world was secure. And now was time to deal with Korea. He used his dreadnought to attack a flotilla of ships that was guiding the Nightshare Thought ship, a great vessel that he believed contained the location of a place of immense light, known as the Gift Mast. When he boarded the ship, he found Korea and squarely defeated it, even as Korea tried to simulate him and his power. Korea was taken, and Oryx presented its remains to Savathun with but a single change from the typical beings of the Taken, namely, that it had a small fragment of its independence still left, and it was not completely bound to the will of its controller. From here, the Hive took their time and prepared to make an assault on the Gift Mast, which they had now found. The civilization surrounding this great place of light had been passed over by the Traveler, which had altered the gravity of a black hole so that the worlds around it might not be devoured, and would instead flourish within its now altered accretion disk. They would be provided warmth and sustenance, and their civilization would grow. And as a monument to the light, the Traveler erected a gift mast, a great spear-like structure that jutted from the black hole and was filled with the power of the light. A gleaming monument rising forth from a singularity, filled with the energies of life itself. The Hive wished to devour this light, and as the Deep was moving in this direction to devour the whole system, so too would the Hive naturally be its vanguard. They marched upon the Wishmast, killing the Harmony, its occupants, and the Ahamkara, the great dragons that lived among them. But as the Gift Mask was being devoured by Oryx's brood, and as his victory was certain, Savathun departed her brother, saying that they needed to grow distant from each other. She took her moons and her brood, and they fell into the black hole that the Harmony lived around, never to be heard from again. In the same stroke, Shivar Wrath took her broods and war moons and fled into the night with a similar purpose. Both of their throne worlds became distant and inaccessible to Oryx, and he was left to ponder. It was here that Oryx reaffirmed his choices and his belief in the darkness, but Oryx also pondered the question of what should happen if he should die. He surmised that the one who killed him should be the one who understood the universe in a more complete manner than him, and he believed that he would only be killed by something mighty, something that had some greater knowledge of the sword logic, perhaps, or perhaps with some clever trap. He therefore decided to lay out a means by which he might survive, even if he was destroyed. Within the Books of Sorrow, he created a map to a weapon that exemplified everything that he was, that, in a certain way, was him if created. And a being that wielded this weapon and used it to become mightier than both of them would be Oryx living on, and Oryx deduced that they would become one and the same, a means by which he could truly become immortal even beyond a true death. This weapon would not see construction for generations, but when it was, it would be a weapon of malice, and we would be the ones to construct it. But the tale of the Osmium dynasty would not be simply left there. Oryx's second son, Nokris, who was born as a lesser being of wisdom as opposed to strength, wished for more power, and knew that his strength was in that of his mind. He went to the worms, his god, to Yul, to Zol, to Aya and Ur, and he petitioned them, asking them for knowledge of the origin of all things. All the worm gods denied him, except one, Zol, the Will of Thousands, who was lesser than his brethren, and saw that in time he would be prey for his peer Yul. He gave a portion of his power to the young Hive Prince, and taught him the art of bringing forth life from death, necromancy. But the power Nokris held had been given and not taken, and this infuriated Oryx, who saw his son's actions for what they were, heretical to the very ideals of the sword logic, and a betrayal of his own dynasty. He cast out his son and removed all record of him from every Hive archive. The only record of Nokris that remained was a single statue before the altar of Oryx, which stood defiant in its permanence. These are some of the earliest tales of the universe of Destiny, tales that predate even our own history, but as many of you will realize, they are but a small part of a grander cosmic war, a war between formless and form, between the deep and the sky, between the dark and the light. The Traveler, the divine presence of the sky, would continue onwards, evading the Hive and the darkness, seeking out the call of worlds with the potential to receive its light, for those with meaning in their roar. And thus the Traveler would make its way to the Elixni, but they would suffer much the same fate as the Harmony and the Ammonite and the Ecumene, and they would suffer at the hands of the darkness and the Hive. Their entire system was destroyed in an event remembered only to the Elixni as the Whirlwind, where they were left to make a great exodus and abandon their home, following whatever trace of the Traveler they could. The Great Machine, as they would come to call it, would however find a new place to set its roots. As the Elixni transformed their once noble society into a more barbaric and tribal one, the Traveler had begun to take root above a system and a planet far, far away. The name of the planet was Mars, the name of the system was Sol, and the year in the human Gregorian calendar was that of 2014. And in this year, it found us. In that year of 2014, humanity witnessed an unknown artifact entering the orbit of the atmosphere of our closest neighboring planet of Mars. It was clear for all to see. Humanity was no longer alone in the universe. This strange object was of immediate concern to the powers of Earth, and 15 months later, with cooperation, planning, and commitment, humanity sent its response. The combined powers of the People's Republic of China, Russian Federation, and United States of America led to the creation of the most famous space voyage known in human history, the voyage that would come to be known as Ares 1. And so it was that one taikonaut, one cosmonaut, and one astronaut, Chow, Mielova, and Hardy, all set out on a journey that would change history. Mars, of course, is a planet with little to no atmosphere, and yet, when the Ares 1 craft touched down, it did so in the middle of a storm, the breath of God as the wind buffeted them back and forth before landing. This was not some strange coincidence. This was the work of the artifact. And as they took their gear and trekked across the Martian surface, they could start to see the artifact come into view over the horizon. As they crested the ridge ahead of them, they saw it completely for the first time. It was at this moment that the first Martian rains began to pour, and the actions of the object were made clear. It was terraforming Mars. And something else became clear as well. This alien presence was not some conqueror or some terrible invader, but was instead benevolent. They called it the Traveler, and its arrival in Sol would change humanity forever. This would be known as the start of our Golden Age. The Traveler's divine presence would be a boon to our system, and under the radiance of its light, Sol, Earth, and humanity would blossom. The planets and moons of the system were terraformed, with worlds like Mars and Venus becoming habitable planets with diverse ecosystems of life and repositories of resources. The moon became the way station for all of the system, sending resources from Earth to far-off colonies on the methane oceans of Titan or the garden world of Mercury. But perhaps the most profound change of them all was the people of Earth themselves. Human lifespans tripled, and the fundamental ethos of our society changed and evolved. Not only were we more intelligent and longer lived as a species, but we also put that knowledge to use instead of squandering it. We cured a myriad of diseases that had haunted us, put study into any number of emerging scientific and philosophical fields, and we extinguished the old hatreds of mankind's past forever. Humanity created vast monuments throughout the solar system as the Traveler worked to seed it for us. From the great Martian city of Freehold to the new Pacifica arcology of Titan, from the solar research stations of Mercury to the Ishtar Academy on Venus. Humanity began to flourish in every place imaginable in the system. Beyond merely the places we laid claim to, there were the remarkable accomplishments we attained in this time, with the great minds of the Clovis Bray Corporation and others like them leading the way and bringing forth some of humanity's greatest inventions. The rise of one of these was most notorious and important of all, the War Mind, Rasputin, a supercomputer tasked with the mandate of defending humanity from extrasolar threats or sky shock alerts. Rasputin was an intelligence of such immense might that it was capable of predicting and calculating threats before having even encountered them, and of devising a solution to them so that they might never threaten humanity even if they did enter the system. Rasputin was armed with a vast defensive array of weapons and doomsday devices that could scorch black the skies of 1,000 worlds in the name of humanity's defense, should the need arise. But this wasn't the only great invention of Clovis Bray. They also created many incredible technologies, such as the intelligent nanotechnology known as SIVA, which could be commanded to construct anything imaginable. This made it a particularly valuable technology to those colonists who were heading outward to the stars, as it could be spontaneously used to create anything from a prefabricated shelter to an oxygen rebreather, if given the correct direction. Furthermore, when relic iron, a mysterious new material, was studied on Mars, the Clovis Bray Corporation discovered an entirely new state of matter, where data was completely free from the restraints of physical matter. This state was known as engram, and it allowed any idea imaginable to be stored. And of course, there were the Exos, a project of Clovis Bray that allowed humans to transplant their consciousness into a mechanical body and live on past the point of normal human life expectancies. However, there are hints in the programming and the past lives of Exos still alive today that give us an idea that they may have been more violent in nature. The Exos dream of a place where they were born, the Deep Stone Crypt, and whilst some of them go there and walk peacefully through a field of golden millet, most of them dream of almost endless battle to reach the tower where they were born. But this is not to say that Clovis Bray was not the only one researching remarkable technologies for humanity or making incredible discoveries throughout the system. The researchers of the Ishtar Academy on Venus at this time discovered the ruins of an ancient civilization on Venus that predated humanity by billions of years. These were the Vex, and the ruins they discovered were those of the Vault of Glass and the Infinite Steps. The Ishtar Academy and the Ishtar Collective would make it their responsibility to study the Vex and their constructs at any place possible. As our golden age magnified our glory, humanity's greatness shone like a beacon in the night, illuminating the very stars themselves, and convincing us that our destiny was not to remain on Earth like our ancestors, or to continue their petty wars, but instead was to reach forwards and upwards, to the stars, and to grasp the very majesty and grandeur of the universe itself. We flew out into those stars and spread our wings. Alas, that we let our hubris get the better of us. Not all were so ill-prepared or foolish, though. Whilst most sat in complacency beneath the glorious bounty of the traveller, some, such as the 3 families of the Black Armory, would begin crafting phase technology and weapons so that they might fight back or defend themselves. A noble effort, but tragically, it would not be even close to enough to stop what would come next. As the centuries of the Golden Age passed, the Warmind began to detect something far beyond the reaches of the system, something dark and terrible, something that spelled our doom. Rasputin's responsibility was to defend humanity, and to this end, the Exodus program was created, a colonization effort that involved thousands upon thousands of souls, all being loaded onto colony ships and sent outward to the stars. But in spite of this titanic effort by Rasputin and his subminds, such as Malahayati, in spite of the valiant efforts of General Chen Lanshu, in spite of everything that humanity would attempt to accomplish before the end, it would not be enough. As the vessels of the Exodus program began to reach further out towards the edges of the solar system, something terrible and dark swept them back in the other direction. The Warmind raised its mighty weapons that were strong enough to shatter the might of stars, and responded to this threat with the full fury of its arsenal. But alas, even this was not enough. The darkness had found our system, and in doing so, had found the Traveler. Doom was upon us. The Golden Age was ending. The collapse had begun. The dark tide that was upon our system brought with it a terrible doom that could not be defeated by the Warmind and its defenses. But the foe Rasputin faced was not by any measure one that could be considered normal. The darkness, much like the Traveler, defied simple causality and defied even the basic rules and logics of the universe. Physics, mathematics, they meant nothing before this entity. It could not be defeated with the weapons of the Warmind alone, and it was made clear from this moment that our annihilation was inevitable. The vessels further out in the bounds of our system were crushed by the darkness as they attempted to reach beyond the asteroid belt. These ships would eventually form a mass of broken debris within the belt itself, and this place, this terrifying graveyard of all that humanity had hoped to see, this would come to be known as the Reef. And this would be a fate much like many of those on Earth and its colonies would suffer. They would be crushed beneath the wheel of the shadow of darkness as it passed ever onwards through the howling void of the universe, killing indiscriminately in the name of its twisted logic that life should be able to fight and meet strength with strength. But the darkness's fury was not yet sated. The darkness had another target in mind. It was also here for the Traveler. The details and accounts from this time are limited and unclear, but there are several accounts worth referring to when speaking of the darkness during the collapse. The account from Cade Six's journals speak of a terrible miasma that spread across the many worlds of the system, holding every human it could find in its grasp and drowning them in a tide of doom and despair. Cade seemed to point towards the darkness having a malicious consciousness. As it was drowning its victims, the victims were allowed to be fully conscious. They were aware, they were lucid, and yet even as agony and pain washed over them, the darkness wished them to witness the destruction of their world. It wished them to know they had been beaten, outmatched, and utterly destroyed, that they were unworthy of existence, that they were prey, nothing more. The Black Armory Papers, a series of journal entries kept by the founder, Henrietta Meran, detailed another encounter with the darkness. Their group had been locked within one of the fortified facilities of the Black Armory, and had to hold back terrible, indescribable creatures that broke through their defenses. They smelled only like wet earth, and made sounds akin to the screeching of machinery. One thing that is made clear by every entry is that the foe that had taken Earth was a terrible one that would see us all destroyed if something was not done. At this time in the system, others were starting to stake their claims too. It was in these moments that another terrible pair of interlopers arrived. Nokris and Zol, the Will of Thousands, took it upon themselves to claim the planet of Mars and to rain down an assault on Hellas Basin, where Rasputin's main control center was kept. However, in a successful attempt to hold off the forces of the Hive Prince and the Worm God, Rasputin used its power to flash freeze the entire region, locking the Worm God, the Prince, and their Hive servants away under a thick sheet of ice. In turn, Rasputin too would also experience a period of dormancy. We would hear nothing from Rasputin's true centralized network for centuries, as only fragments of him remained within the various Warmind bunkers that were still active across Earth and its many territories. What happened next is an event clouded in mystery and uncertainty. Some spread rumors that the Traveler was in the process of fleeing the system, as it had done so many times before. Others spread rumors that Rasputin might have engaged the Traveler as it attempted to flee in order to prevent this outcome. And some merely believed that the Traveler was attempting to find the right spot to stand and fight against the menace that had embroiled itself throughout our system. Whatever the truth might be, the Traveler moved from its previous resting place on Io and found its way to Earth. Here it would make a titanic stand against its enemy, the darkness. The battle was long and would shake the heavens and the earth, a battle of proportions that the universe perhaps had never seen before, of the titanic forces of the cosmos, of a yin and a yang, smashing against each other, breaking upon each other like waves on rock, with enough force to level a mountain and raise it again within the blink of an eye. The two fought. The two stood. The two tested themselves. And what's more, the Traveler won. It was crippled and broken, but it sacrificed itself to save us and to push back the darkness. But its sacrifice was not without some form of hope. With the Traveler's dying breath, it created the Ghosts. Small, autonomous drones filled with the power of its light. These ghosts would serve the forces of humanity and would seek out those amongst the worthy dead who might possibly provide hope to humanity and its defenders. These would be the few chosen champions that could wield the Traveler's light as a weapon. In the earliest days that followed the collapse, these beings were known as the Risen, and whilst they would come later to be known as Warlords or Iron Lords or simply Lightbearers, today they are known by a simpler name: the Guardians. With the terrible events of the final clash ended and the ghosts released into our system, the events that would make up the collapse would come to a close. But there was one far stranger account from the collapse that was given, an account from one of the Exodus program vessels that hit the asteroid belt just as the darkness was approaching in earnest. This vessel, Exodus Green, alternatively known as Yang Liwei, would become the crucible of the forces of light and dark, and would become the birthplace of an entirely new species of beings. It is here, in these most calamitous of moments, that the people known as the Awoken were born. What follows next is another account that is shrouded in mystery, a report of how a new kind of being was brought into our world, one of both the light and the dark, of the deep and the sky. They were known as the Awoken. Their history is recorded in a series of documents, but the most notorious of these is known as the Mara Sena, which talks of the rise of their entire civilization and how they came to join humanity in the struggle that had consumed them. It speaks of a great rift not only at the center of the Awoken soul, but also, in time, within the Awoken people. A people that would be riven by circumstance, choice, and their leaders. The Mara Sena also comes with a warning, namely that in our attempts to grasp its truth, we may in fact mistakenly learn to believe a lie. It is therefore once again at this point that I should state that the story of the Awoken's creation is told through a single source, and that the truth of the matter may yet elude us. But with that said, yet again it is our only source of context, and so, as best we know it, this is the history of the Awoken people. Aboard one of the Exodus program vessels, Exodus Green, alternatively known as Yang Liwei, the captain, Alice Lee, detected a strange signal that was following them for approximately 18 hours in radio silence. After repeatedly ignored hails, and just as Captain Lee cut the engines so that she might make a sharp about turn and face their ghostly stalker, a message was received from the Warmind Rasputin. Rasputin had detected a hostile extrasolar intruder in the system and had initiated a Kahe White emergency, bringing all of the potential weapons in the system under his control. Rasputin demanded control of the Exodus Green and its onboard guns. But as Captain Alice Lee decided what to do next, torn between her colonial mission and her duty to Earth, darkness swarmed around the hull of the ship, and through its veil, even the light could not be seen. Terrible gravity waves shook the ship as they simultaneously compressed and expanded every molecule of the crew and their vessel. After the vote from the crew came in to continue onward instead of returning to Earth, Alice Lee attempted to send a signal broadcasting a declaration of neutrality to their unknown assailant. Alice Lee stated that they wished to be treated as a separate species that was not party to baseline human conflicts or their allegiance to the Traveler. She prayed that this would be enough to make a difference against such an indifferent darkness. It was at this moment that two members of the crew were out on the hull. One of them had followed the other out. The first of them, Mara, had gone out there to die alone. She had kicked off the hull with 50 kilometers worth of tether, and her brother, Aldwin, had followed her out into the darkness. As the message requesting the massive entity's indifference was broadcast by the captain, the darkness around them abated, and Mara saw a pinprick of light. It was at this moment that Mara found herself and all the occupants of the crew of the ship behind her, threatened to be crushed between the mighty presence of light that had just arrived and the terrible darkness that swarmed the area. The colossal forces of light and dark that clashed here smashed into one another yet again, filling the space with so much power and energy that the universe itself struggled to maintain what bounds of law that it could. This was a battleground that was being decimated by the powers of two paracausal entities. It was like dividing by zero or counting infinity. And as the two violent entities finally reached an equilibrium, the real effect of the power began to manifest. The universe created a singularity, a gaping black hole, as an effort was made to cease the paracausal forces that were tearing the very seams of reality apart. The forces of the universe swirled and buffeted around Mara, and it was at this moment that the mistakes of the universe were to be swallowed inside the singularity. Everything pulled forth, and darkness and light continued to fight. And at this moment, Mara made a choice that would change the universe. She detached herself from the 50 kilometers of tether that joined her and the ship, and together, all were pulled down into the singularity. All of them had the same fate, to be swallowed by this black hole. But Mara knew what she wanted. Mara knew her fate. She reached out at the edge of death and knew that she would be the first. But it was not death and sweet silence that found her. Instead, it was new life and a place of miracles. The Awoken records next speak of Captain Alice Lee experiencing a primordial divinity of sorts. As her existence increased in complexity, she developed a small sense of purpose that grew and blossomed until she willed into existence the world that she wished to have found for her people, and in doing so, willed herself into that world as a being not of divine presence, but still of an immortal one. Then she fell to this earth and lived upon it. She believed herself to be the first among the new peoples, and perhaps the only one. But then, lying on a black stone, somewhere near a crashed remnant of the ship, she discovered Mara. As Mara woke, she realized where they were, in a world of incredible bounty within the folded fabric of hidden space-time. They were inside the black hole. Alice Lee inquired why it was Mara that happened to be second. Mara stated that she didn't know. The first lie to be told upon this new world. But Alice Lee believed her, and so they went on to rouse their new people into this new world. And so it was that the crew was roused, and out of the original 40,900 crew members of Yang Lewei, 40,891 awoke, with 9 being unaccounted for. A council was called, and it led the new people to declare certain principles and verdicts. They called themselves the Awoken, and they were immortal. They called their new world within the singularity the Distributory, and they believed that they should never return from where they had been. They created a group of specialists called UTECs to care for the technology of the ship from which they had emerged, and decreed that under careful supervision they would reproduce with wombs of flesh and machine, given that any they added to their number would be immortal too. The population of the new awoken people was greatly imbalanced, with 3 times more women than there were men, and as a result, until more men were born, they were placed under the protection of the women. Above all, some of the most important verdicts created at this council were the 6th, 7th, and 8th, stating respectively that the Awoken should know and love the cosmos, that the Awoken were created from a covenant of light and dark, but that the covenant was complete and no further debt should be paid, and finally, that the Awoken were whole in themselves, existing in balance. It was also at this meeting that a final 9th verdict was declared, which was that unanimously the people would recognize Alice Lee as their queen. And so the Awoken went out, and explored their new world, charting its seas, forests, and stars. This was a great time of creation and pioneering for the new people, and whilst Alice Lee declared as her first rule that there would be no secrets amongst the Awoken, even here, in this place of new paradise and prosperity, conflict would brew. The Awoken spread across the face of the distributory, and took on as many diverse lifestyles as one could imagine, from intrepid hunters to great seafarers to sage scholars. But amongst those people, differences of opinion would dwell, and some would come to doubt their purpose on this world. Some dwelt within the cities and preached the doctrine that revered the seventh verdict, that the Awoken were made from the completed covenant of light and dark, and that their debt was completely paid. They believed wholeheartedly that their place within the universe carried no responsibilities, and there would be no repercussions for their action. But those who dwelt within the country, as many Awoken did, were of the Echolist belief, who did not believe in the seventh verdict, and saw that the clash of titanic forces that birthed them was still going on. They believed that they owed a cosmic debt, one that would eventually need to be repaid. These two ideologies could not be so easily brought into balance. The Echolists and their opposing sanguine believers were divided, but then a spark ignited a flame. An Echolist known as the Diacerm walked into the cities and loudly accused Queen Alice Lee of deicide, the murder of gods. When questioned about this claim, she stated that when Alice Lee had created the world, she could have conceived of it to create the Awoken as gods so that they might be free from all forms of suffering and pain. Immortality was one thing, but to be truly powerful, and yet to be denied this? Deicide was an appropriate term, perhaps. If this was true, this represented an original sin, and what's more, it represented a secret that Alice had kept, even as she had declared that the Awoken were not to keep secrets. The division between those that believed they owed a debt to the cosmos and those that did not ultimately led to a conflict between the Awoken peoples known as the Theodicy Wars. And whilst the nature of the conflict, at least in the Mara Sena, is indicated to be of a smaller nature, nonetheless, people died, and the balance between the two sides had to be struck and a truce negotiated. Alice Lee petitioned Mara Sov, who had been part of the Echolist camp, to find her mother, who was a skilled negotiator and could broker the peace. The mother of Mara and Aldrin, who had been returned to life as Aldrin, saw through Mara's games, however, and saw part of the truth, which was that Mara, not the Diacerm, was the source of the Echolist movement. The Diacerm was merely a pawn. This was part of the truth, but not the whole truth, a truth that was known only to Mara for a great deal of time. The monarchy of the Awoken would in time wane in power, and a new group of scholars would come to be the most influential body of rulers. They were known as the Gensum scribes, some of whom still persist in the warlock orders of today. The scribes, who would routinely send Gensum knights on missions to test the reality that they had been studying, knew that Mara and Aldrin were gathering lore and prophecies pointing towards the potential day when the Echolists would be proven correct, and when the Awoken would need to repay their debt. The Gensum scribes knew that this could cause another Theodicy war, and so when a tall, strong warrior named Sieur Ido walked into the court of the scribes and demanded the knowledge necessary to hunt and kill Mara for her supposed murder of the Diacerm, the Gensum scribes obliged, and gave Sieur the knowledge she would need to hunt down Mara. However, a second Awoken queen was rising to prominence in the Awoken monarchy. Ngoya Pin received a cloaked and masked woman in her court one day, whispered by some to be Mara and others to be the Diacerm. Whatever the case, it mattered not, for after a long time of having the cloaked figure reside within her court, the monarch declared herself a true Echolist. She bound the ambition and knowledge of the Gensum scribes to the Echolist's preferred task, and so the scribes set about on the course of attempting to understand if the Awoken owed the cosmos a debt or not. The royal palace was turned into a center of learning and a feast of ideas that radically advanced the Echolist cause. Into this feast strode Sieur Ido, her cloak and longbow at her side. She was looking for the hooded figure. She believed that hooded figure to be Mara, and so she followed her to a laboratory, deducing that this would now be the time to draw her weapon. However, as she was about to kill Mara, she saw her face and was bewitched by her beauty and her grace, and this quelled Sieur's desire to see vengeance for the Diasome that she believed Mara had defeated and killed. She threw the weapon between them and told Mara that she could not bring herself to kill, but that the debt of her battle needed to be paid. She would fight Mara to the agony or die trying. And so, Mara called upon Aldrin, her brother, who would battle upon her behalf. Aldrin suggested not one but 3 duels, with blade, rifle, and 5th generation air superiority fighter. These duels and the prospect of Mara's murder troubled the Gensum scribes, as they did not want to appear to have invited murder upon the one who had extensively informed the beliefs of the Queen. It would be like killing her priest or her closest confidant. They retreated from the Echolist mission and from the Queen's court, and as the scribes fled the palace in droves, many key contractors in the mission to understand if the Echolists were correct or not sensed hesitation and withdrew their support too. To this, Queen Dingoya Pin denounced the scribes and called them faithless and selfish, which only further deepened the tensions between the Sanguine, who believed that the Covenant was complete, and the Echolists, who were even more doubtful than ever of the 7th verdict. The political tension continued to deepen as Aldrin and Sieur held their duels. The first duel was held with knives and pitted Sieur's simpler, strong jabs against Aldrin's whirling theatre of the blade. But they were equally matched, and a draw was called. In the second challenge, the two chose long rifles and hunted each other for days throughout the jungle. Whilst Aldrin blended in and used his stealthy abilities to hide and stake out the fight, Sieur simply let her blunt nature disturb the wildlife around her, which appropriately disrupted and revealed Aldrin. She shot him as he crossed a riverbed, wounding him, but not killing him. For the final challenge, the two chose 5th generation fighters with the full complement of weapons available to either of them. If the full complement could not be supplied, most crucially, it would be simulated instead, and if a simulated kill was attained, it was worth equal value to that of a real kill. Not all weapons were available. In particular, a nuclear payload was not something that the Awoken had kept around, having disposed of those weapons a long time before. Sieur chose an Ermine tactical fighter with a payload of heat-seeking missiles, and Aldrin chose a ship known as a Dart, which was an exceedingly old fighter with terrible onboard systems that would be easily outmatched by the faster Ermine. Sieur might have been able to sense that something was wrong at this point, but regardless, accepted the duel. And 8 miles out from engaging Aldrin in the middle of the sky, Sieur's computer informed her that in a simulated manner, Aldrin had killed her. In fact, he had killed her and everything in a 4-mile radius. Long ago, during an age when the Dart was constructed, the Awoken had used military-grade ship-to-ship nuclear payloads on the Dart. This was still a part of its payload, and Aldrin had simulated firing one of these, and by the result, had ended the duel, and in a simulated manner killed Sieur. After all their fighting, and after all the immense desire for revenge that Sieur held, the two were tied. Sieur threw herself before Mara, informing her that she had fought to a standstill with Aldrin. Sieur left her fate in Mara's hands, and Mara lifted her face, telling her to join them and to be of service to her. And so Sieur did, and from that day forth until her dying day, served at the right hand of Mara Sov. Later, Mara would meet with Ngoya Pin, and Ngoya would inform Mara that she was abdicating the throne. Mara had manipulated the monarchy and the Jensum scribes to ensure that her needs, both scientific and political, had been accomplished, and Ngoya knew this. This was a rebuke, as much as one could be made against Mara, but it was already too late. Mara had accomplished her purpose, and was even planning ways to implement the monarch who would supplant Ngoya. After some more time passed, Mara finally put her plan into action. She proposed to the awoken people and her followers that the hour of their reckoning was at hand, and that the time to repay their debt to the cosmos had come. Thousands flocked to Mara's banner, and an expeditionary force was formed, creating the basis for a journey by the awoken people into space, back through the black hole, back to where they had come from. The expedition was 12.1 billion years in the making, for time was slower within the black hole. When they would emerge, hopefully not much time would have passed at all. Mara had been preparing for this moment ever since she had been reborn. Before she departed, there were two things she had to do. The first was to ask for a boon from the first queen, Alice Lee, and the second was to say goodbye to her mother one last time. The mother who would not be joining Mara on the voyage back to Sol. In spite of all her power and all her plans and all her manipulations, Mara could not bring her mother with her. She could not convince her to change her ways. Her mother was happy and did not wish to change her life. And Mara knew no matter how much they argued, she could not be swayed. She tried nonetheless, and their final words were bitter and unresolved. But this was nothing compared to the wrath that Mara would experience at the hands of Alice Lee as they spoke later. When Mara arrived, she endeavored to tell Alice Lee the truth, and for this truth that she would tell, the boon that she would ask of Alice Lee was forgiveness. Alice Lee had long suspected that Mara was behind the awoken people being so divided, so riven. She believed Mara to be the one who had influenced the Diasum and the Ecolists into creating a society that would always have a discontented few, feeling guilt in their debt to the universe. But she could not possibly imagine the scale and brilliance of Mara's design. Mara told her the terrible truth, that Alice Lee only believed herself to be the first being in existence in the new world of the Distributory. And she only believed herself to be the first because Mara had desired it to be that way. For it was Mara who had been the first to cross the event horizon that led to the Distributory. Mara who had designed the world and all its flaws. Mara who had planted the division in the awoken people. Mara who had been the devil that had invented suffering and invited it into the Garden of Eden that was the Distributory. All this so that 12.1 billion years later she could enact the plan that she had set into motion, so that she could take the skeptics and the guilty and lead them back through the singularity to help fight the cosmic war that had birthed them, so that their debt to the cosmos could be repaid. It was this, the creation of suffering within a perfect world, the first sin within the Distributory, the manifestation of evil that Mara asked for forgiveness for. Forgiveness was not what she received from Alice Lee. It was only fury. It was time for Mara and the expedition to depart at long last. The Awoken were returning to the place of their true birth. Before they left the world of the Distributory, there was an alert. Retribution of some form had come for them. Missiles from the surface of the Distributory's planet were being launched, and Mara initiated an emergency launch back through the singularity. Despite the slew of missiles damaging some of the ships, the crews made it mostly unharmed. But Mara was unable to send a final message to her mother, and so she would never know any more from the woman that had raised her. But now was not the time for sorrow. Now Mara needed resolve. she returned through the singularity and emerged back in Sol. On the other side, they were greeted by a system in ruin. The collapse had taken its toll, and Sol was mostly unrecognizable. The once mighty domain of humanity was left shattered and lawless, left in squalor, and without hope of salvation or nobility. Whether Mara and the Awoken owed the debt to the cosmos was a subject of debate that one could potentially hold for 12.1 billion years, but the reality before them demanded a response now. Humanity was on its last legs, and undoubtedly the Awoken could help. Initially, they settled within the asteroid belt, around a massive string of ships, broken but tethered together near Vesta. This was a closeness that originally had kept them alive, and in the end, this was something that would serve the new life of the Awoken. This would now be their new domain, the Reef. As they settled, Keldawaj and the other Uteks who accompanied them, now known as Tekkens, divined that some kind of magic had followed them through, and that the Awoken were giving off a strange series of effects, best described as magic. They defied the powers of the universe. Mathematics, gravity, just in the same way the darkness and light did, but tied to neither. Some Awoken were capable of this acausal effect and others were not, but the effect was strongest around Mara. The Awoken would then also endure a series of attacks by the Elixni, who had succeeded in following the Traveler from their system of origin all the way to its final resting place in Sol. The Awoken fought them back when they attacked. Mara and Aldrin and Zure led the charge every time. Zure's might, Aldrin's speed, and Mara's raw power delivered the Awoken to victory. It was around this time, however, that Mara would also be petitioned by the Awoken for the right to leave the fleet of ships in the Reef and to immediately aid the remnants of humanity. Mara's plan involved them building up a base of power in secret so they could better understand the system before them. The Awoken who wished to leave immediately, however, grew tired of this, and after one craft made a break for it, Mara's own wish was that the Awoken should be given a choice. In all fairness, she had no other options. Mara stated that they were given one chance, and that if they chose to leave, they would not be permitted to return. And so the once riven Awoken were riven again, and those that departed for the worlds of humanity would be of great assistance, but they would no longer be known as the Reef-born Awoken. They would be known as the Earth-born Awoken. Thus, a great people was sundered twice. The Earth-born Awoken that went out into the system were greeted by horrors present to the collapse and the following age of darkness that came with it. They would help to rebuild, but there was no longer a system in which they could see humanity flourishing immediately. The Golden Age was gone, and when the Awoken had returned, humanity had spun into a new age of existence. A dark age, when all but the faintest of hopes had been snuffed out. At the end of the collapse, and the start of this new dark age of humanity, the world was left in utter chaos. Whilst some small groups had survived in underground bunkers, such as those fortunate enough in the Black Armory, and whilst others had managed to evade destruction in the wilds, most of humanity lay dead at the hands of the terrible power that invaded the system and challenged the Traveler. We were now left shattered and broken, with no clear means of communication with our outer colonies, and with all the in-system trade scuttled. Humanity was cut off and helpless. Only on Earth did anyone really face any prospect of survival or salvation. Not only did humanity face the constant pressing troubles of starvation and exposure, but they also now shared their worlds with a series of strange and deadly forces from many other reaches of the universe. The Vex, that had once been found on Venus, had surfaced on Mars and Mercury as well, and had utterly transformed Mercury from a garden world into one that was now entirely mechanical, with at least a portion of it hollowed out into a giant simulation engine known as the Infinite Forest. Aside from the Vex, a military power known as the Cabal had also sent 5 of its legions to secure Mars, and to set up a base of operations there so they could launch campaigns into the rest of the system. The 5 legions, the Sand Eaters, Dust Giants, Siege Dancers, Blind Legion, and Skyburners, fought ferociously, knowing that they could only return home if they completed their mission here. Whilst on Mars, they also began to contest the Vex for ownership of the world, but the Vex defended in great numbers, defending almost more fiercely than they did at any other place. The Elixni had also followed the Traveller into Sol, and were now known as the Fallen by the facets of humanity that encountered them, and they spread throughout the system from the Jovian moons to Venus to Earth, with several major houses such as the House of Devils and House of Winter laying claims to vast tracts of land within the territories that were once humanity's. Earth's Cosmodrome in particular was a point of great infestation. And finally, arrived the vanguard of Oryx's Hive, with the Hidden Swarm, Blood of Oryx, and Spawn of Crota all taking root within Luna. They dug deep into our moon and prepared for yet another one of their grand conquests, creating a shadowy, subterranean fortress known as the Hellmouth, in the region formerly known as the Ocean of Storms. This would burrow so deep into the core of the moon that no light could reach its deepest recesses. These alien forces would help to set the world into chaos, and in the Dark Age, almost nobody could consider themselves to be safe from the conflict that had engulfed all the worlds of humanity. It was at this time that the first of the Lightbearers began to rise and stake their claim in the world around them. These earliest Guardians were not truly Guardians. They were tyrants who saw their newfound immortality as a tool to be abused, as well as their light. There was no duty for them, and all they sought to do was to wage war for whatever they could get their hands on. Many of them would acquire valuable weapons and assets throughout the system, and for a time, humanity's only source of hope would instead be a source of tyranny. But that is not to say that all of the risen Lightbearers were conquerors or villains. Amongst their number rose an order of men and women who would be amongst the first to hold to the true duty of the Risen, to protect humanity and to serve the light. These would be the warriors of legend who challenged and eventually defeated the warlords of Earth. They were known as Iron Lords, and the first 4 amongst their number swore on the day of their founding that they would be protectors and guardians of the people of Earth. And so, Radagast, Perun, Yolda, and Saladin represented some of the first true saviors of humanity. However, defending humanity was not an easy task. Much of them had been disconnected and were lost, broken in the terrible calamity that was the collapse. But as we always have, we survived and collected together. Sometimes into small towns, such as those most fabled places of Palamon or Coyote, who planted their flags and endeavored to make a living off of what remained of the system's bounty. But the greatest gathering of all was that of a massive camp of refugees that flocked to beneath the Traveller, to the place of its final titanic battle against the darkness. The camp began as a simple thing, defended by a few risen, and huddled for warmth around fires and in furs. In such a fearful place, disillusion brewed quickly into adversity. Rudimentary factions began to rise with differing outlooks on the best way to control and run this would-be camp. These factions grew until eventually risen enforcers backed them on either side, and with them involved, conflict eventually broke out in the form of what would be known as the Faction Wars, with some among the Risen, however, seeking to end the violence.
It was in this moment that the Fallen attacked the camp. The factions were broken, but the Risen, who had backed them on either side of the divide, all united and collapsed upon the Fallen with terrible power. The Fallen were repelled, and the new factions were left broken. However, this was a lesson, and the Guardians sought to see that this could never happen again, for this was truly the first point at which they could be called Guardians. For after all, had they not simply accomplished their duty to defend humanity against the invaders of the system? From this conflict, a new system of governance was born. It would be impossible to stop the factions from existing, and so the Consensus was created, as well as the Vanguard. The Consensus was a council of both the Vanguard and many represented factions, all of which would be able to submit proposals to the Speaker, a leader of sorts who had arisen with the supposed ability to speak to the Traveler. The Vanguard was something entirely different, though. The Vanguard was a part of the Consensus, but they were a council of 3 Guardians, one from each discipline: Hunter, Titan, and Warlock. With them, the Guardians would be represented, and with them, they would be officially classified. And so at last, laws were passed and enacted, and a government with clear authority in hand was born. With it, the turmoil of the people began to cease, and what was once a small camp of refugees beneath the Traveler began to grow and blossom, first into a settlement, and then into a bastion. The final bastion beneath our broken god. They would call it the Last City. But this Lost City would not stand without challenges or foes to make them. The most persistent threat was ever that of the Fallen, with their lightning-fast raiding parties and their unwavering ferocity. Though the offensives would start as small acts of piracy, they would eventually grow into a perpetual siege that would be as defining a characteristic of life within the city as the very air they breathed. The siege in itself, and the very notion of the Fallen continually attacking the city's walls, was nicknamed the 100-Year Siege, for it seemingly never ended. However, to counteract this perpetual threat, the Titans of the city came up with a solution in the form of a series of walls that encompassed the city. As the walls were built, great defensive installations were placed along their length, including 8 towers, of which now none remain. It was the hope that such a great deterrent, bristling with both the light-bringing guardians and the death-bringing emplacements of guns, would be enough to keep the citizens of the Last City safe from the Fallen. However, the problem was not one that could be solved by high walls and terrifying fortifications, for the Fallen were driven not just by anger, but by a desperate faith. Their true prize was not the eradication of the city or its inhabitants, but the reclamation of the Great Machine, or as we know it, the Traveler. The Fallen had been seeking it out across the dark vacuum of space in true desperation, and imagine their jealousy to understand that when they found it, not only had it been destroyed and was in the possession of humans, but that those humans had not only been gifted with their own golden age, as the Elixni had, but also now were filled with the ranks of Guardians, those who could truly use the Great Machine's power. No, such transgressions were intolerable, and this drove the Fallen to the kind of zeal that only madness of the desperate would dare to invite and entertain. It was then that the Fallen of the House of Devils, with its strongholds located predominantly in Europe, Asia Minor, and Old Russia, struck out in a combined attack on the city. This would be one of the first true tests of the city's resolve, as the Devils brought their terrifying soldiers and artillery to bear, truly living up to their name. But the Titans of the city had prepared an answer. It was not some secret weapon aside from their light, it was not some great strategy, it was simply to hold the line. The 4 orders of Titans, including those such as the Firebreak Order and the Pilgrim Guard, held the 6 approaches to the city in a coordinated defense against the invaders. A great attack was made, and as it was repulsed, there was a chance to charge. But the Titans, including those amongst their order thirsty for blood, held to discipline, and held the line. The battle was long and fierce. The Fallen outnumbered them to an almost comical extent, but the Guardians had the light on their side, and when fighting together, even when outnumbered and overrun, they were seemingly unstoppable, and the waves of attacking Fallen broke upon them with ease. The Titans that day held back the Fallen on 6 different fronts, and not a single one of those fronts had broken. This would be the first great victory for humanity in the Dark Age, and this would be the first time the city had ever been defended against a truly overwhelming foe. It would be forever remembered as the Battle of the 6 Fronts, and this battle was such a great honor to Titans that it remains represented in their heraldic iconography to this very day, with Titan hexagonal designs calling back to this and always being divided into 4. But it was not merely Titans that made up the defenses of the city on this day. One of the most prominent sets of heroes that rose also included a warlock by the name of Osiris. The Titan Saint 14 witnessed his incredible skill in battle, seeing that he was almost seemingly in more places than one at any single point in the battle. And it was at this point that Saint 14, who had closely allied himself with the Speaker, recommended that Osiris should be elevated to the Vanguard Warlock position. The relationship of the Speaker and Saint 14 was so close that they referred to each other as father and son, and at Saint's recommendation the Speaker obliged, and Osiris was proclaimed the new Warlock Vanguard. The only dissenting voice of this decision was that of Lysander and the Concordat, a faction that believed Osiris to be a mistake, a misincarnation or a faulty resurrection by a ghost. The victory at 6 fronts marked not only the end of the first great test for humanity, but also marked the beginning of a new age, where hope blossomed once again in earnest. This would be the end of humanity's dark age, where before they had cowered in huddled masses beneath the Traveler and prayed for deliverance. With the Iron Lords, with the Guardians, with the city, that deliverance had come. Now was the time for humanity to stand once more and to begin to fight back. This was to many amongst the number of the Guardians the birth of what would be known as the City Age. The City Age may be named after the city, but one of the most important things to know about the City Age is merely to do with the incomplete nature of humanity's knowledge. At the time being, there were no dates, no timelines, and of course, our idea of what was blurred and partially incomplete. Such is the nature of a post-apocalyptic era, and there is no real consensus therefore on when the City Age truly began. For some, it was at the victory at 6 fronts, for others the formation of the walls, and for a few still, it was at the creation of the camp beneath the Traveler. But regardless, the City Age began, and it played hosts to ballads of legends, myth, and incredible adventure. The city would expand and grow into a powerful bastion of humanity, and the Guardian Orders would press out into the solar system and commit to brave deeds of heroism. However, the first event that is noted in the timeline of the City Age that is of real significance is that of a terrifying purge of some of the most majestic and dangerous creatures within the system. It would start with the event known by the Guardian Orders as the Great Hunt. But in order to better understand the Great Hunt, you need to start in the Reef, not the city. Back in the Dark Age, when the Awoken had just been split into the Earth and Reefborn, Mara instructed Aldrin to go out into the system and to discover for her a unique source of power. Aldrin returned with what is known as a Wish Dragon, an Ahamkara. Ahamkara are dragons, both sentient and intelligent enough to speak, bargain, and deceive. But this was not the only thing that made the Ahamkara extraordinary. Ahamkara were shapeshifters, capable of growing massive or minuscule in size on a whim, and also had access to a special kind of magic, known as wish magic. This power, as best we know, holds no allegiance to the light or dark, but it manipulates the threads of fate and the fabric of the universe in a similar manner to the power of the light and the dark. It was not some stupendous power capable of crushing atoms, but instead it was a subtle thing that could manipulate the universe without necessarily invoking its physics. Wish magic was named such because it relied on preying on the ambitions and desires of those not strong-willed enough to contest the Ahamkara. The Queen and the dragon Aldrin recovered eventually forged a bond, and the young Ahamkara would come to name itself Riven, in honor of the twice-riven people that was the Awoken. More Ahamkara flocked to the reef, and Awoken society began to revolve around them. It is here that wish magic and the incredible designs of the Awoken came together to create what is known as the Dreaming City, a sacred place to the Awoken, hidden within the stars of the reef itself. In this place, the Ahamkara and the Awoken lived in relative harmony. All seemed peaceful, but the Awoken Queen knew that the Ahamkara could be found all over the system, and that the unique power she had sought was not in fact so unique. But this was not to be forever. She would soon have that unique source of power. It was at this time that the city also began to encounter the dragons, and at which point they realized the danger that they posed. The bargains struck with the Ahamkara had granted the Guardians great power and wisdom and information that was crucial to their campaigns, but had also always come at a terrible cost. This was the nature of wish magic. For every wish granted, there was a terrible, twisted reality to it, one that would always come at the cost of the Guardian themselves or someone around them. With their presence becoming a threat to the safety of the city itself, it was decreed by the consensus that the beasts should be hunted down and made extinct. And so the Great Hunt began, with the city even quietly petitioning the Awoken monarchy for aid. This aid was granted to them in the forms of weapons to hunt the beasts, although this aid was even secretly made available at the request of Riven. Perhaps Riven was fulfilling Mara's wish for some source of power that the wishes always grant the Ahamkara, or perhaps for some unique advantage. But regardless, many great warriors took up the weapons of the Awoken and the city, and took part in the hunt, or at least the process of it. Many terrible final wishes were made by the beasts and their assailants. Some of the scars of those wishes can still be seen today. Though, as with all things to do with wish magic, there are many details that are unclear, or as of yet, unproven. Regardless, the Ahamkara were hunted to the very brink of extinction, with only Riven surviving, trapped within the fortified citadel at the heart of the Dreaming City, in a place known as the Queen's Walk. With that, the only way the Ahamkara could communicate to us was through their remains, which held some of their latent power. But for the most part, it would be generations, even hundreds of years, before the Guardians saw another Ahamkara ever again. However, it was not just the Ahamkara that would start to see their end in this time. The days of the Iron Lords were also numbered. They had continued to exist and to defend the city as they grew in number, sending out Guardians from their base of operations on Fellwinter Peak. The Order had grown to at least 100 in number, but Radagast lamented that whilst he and his Iron Lords could defend humanity and watch over the vast tracts of Earth, they could not so easily return humanity to its golden age of technology. But when Lord Timur, a warlock of the Iron Lords, discovered records of the lost golden age technology of Siva, Radagast leapt into action. The nanotechnology could potentially rebuild the marvels that humanity had lost, and with it at their command, there was the potential for them to do even more incredible things. When the location of the technology's whereabouts had been discovered, particularly the replication complex in the northeastern section of the Cosmodrome, every one of the Iron Lords descended on that part of the world in force, hell-bent on claiming the technology for humanity. It was discovered that the billions upon billions of Siva nanites were still